The fog of the North Sea rolls like smoke across the horizon, cold, gray, and endless. From that fog emerges a leviathan of steel, HMS Hood. Her bow cuts through the water with elegant ferocity, her 4 massive gun turrets facing forward like the eyes of a predator. To anyone watching her from shore, she is more than a warship. She is a national monument, a living testament to an empire that once ruled half the world. When she first touched the sea in 1918, the Great War had ended only weeks before. The world was tired of blood, but Britain was determined that its navy would remain unchallenged. Out of that determination was born the Hood, a battle cruiser designed to be as fast as a destroyer and as powerful as a battleship. Her dimensions were staggering: 860 feet long, weighing over 47,000 tons, with guns that could hurl 15-inch shells weighing nearly a ton each. She could strike targets more than 15 miles away and still move at over 31 knots, faster than almost anything afloat. To the sailors who served aboard her, she was not a ship. She was a home, a fortress, a legend. They called her the Mighty Hood. When she entered port, the world noticed. Crowds gathered, bands played, children waved Union Jacks. Newspapers printed her image beside headlines that spoke of invincibility. She was the embodiment of the Royal Navy's motto, Britannia rules the waves. But behind that magnificent image, there lurked a shadow, a secret that the Admiralty quietly carried. Hood's design was already aging the day she was launched. She was a product of World War I engineering, and though her sides were thick with armor, her deck protection was dangerously thin. Naval combat had evolved. Shells could now arc high through the air, falling vertically onto decks instead of striking the sides. Against such plunging fire, Hood's upper armor could be her doom. Naval architects knew it. So did a handful of officers. But retrofitting her for modern war would have meant months in dry dock, time the Royal Navy didn't have as tensions in Europe rose again. So the Hood sailed on, her flaw buried beneath layers of pride and steel. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, she circled the globe as the crown jewel of British sea power. In every port, from Sydney to Singapore, from Cape Town to Halifax, she represented the might of the empire. Her presence alone could deter conflict. A sailor named able seaman Jack Williams once wrote home, "When the Hood arrives, people stop what they're doing. They look up and salute. It's like seeing the British Empire itself sail into view." She was more than metal. She was morale. But by the late 1930s, the clouds of war were gathering once more. Nazi Germany was rearming. New ships, like the Bismarck, dwarfed anything the British fleet possessed. Some naval officers whispered that Hood's glory days were over, that she was a relic from another age. Still, the Admiralty kept her in service, not because she was perfect, but because Britain needed her image, the illusion of power, the reassurance that its navy still ruled the waves. By 1939, when World War II erupted again, the Hood was nearly 20 years old, an old warrior in a new kind of war. Yet when she left port, sailors still cheered, and civilians still felt safer knowing that the mighty Hood was out there, guarding them. But war has no respect for legends. The next 2 years would test the Royal Navy to its limits. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking convoys faster than Britain could replace them. Supplies grew scarce. Every ship mattered. Every battle could decide survival or starvation. And in 1941, a new threat appeared, one that would change the fate of the Hood forever. The Bismarck, a monster of steel, twice as modern, nearly unsinkable. Rumors spread through naval circles that Bismarck had left her base and was heading into the Atlantic to destroy Britain's supply lines. Panic followed. The Admiralty knew that if Bismarck reached open waters, it could slaughter convoys unchecked. Only one ship in the Royal Navy could match her speed and power. Only one could reach her in time. The order came down: HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales to intercept enemy battleship Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, engage and destroy. When the news reached the Hood, her crew erupted in a mix of pride and apprehension. They knew this was the moment their ship was built for, a chance to defend Britain's honor. But among some officers, there was quiet unease. The Hood was fast, but lightly armored above. The Bismarck was newer, tougher, deadlier. In the wardroom that evening, an officer named Midshipman Rowland reportedly muttered to a friend, "If we find her, God help us." The Bismarck's not just a ship, she's a monster. The Hood's captain, Ralph Kerr, a stern but respected officer, walked the bridge that night as cold waves slapped the hull. He looked out toward the black horizon and said softly, "We've faced worse odds before. We'll do our duty." Below deck, sailors prepared. Ammunition was checked, guns cleaned, life belts tested. The ship hummed with the electric energy of anticipation, part courage, part fear. At dawn the next morning, as the Hood steamed out of Scapa Flow, a light drizzle covered her decks. Dozens of crewmen stood on the rails, watching the gray Scottish coast fade behind them. 18-year-old Ted Briggs, one of the youngest signalmen aboard, later remembered that moment vividly. "We were proud, we felt untouchable. The Hood wasn't just a ship, she was the heartbeat of Britain." None of them knew that within 72 hours, the pride of the Royal Navy would lie shattered on the floor of the North Atlantic. The date was May 21st, 1941. The North Atlantic was a desolate, hostile expanse, wind howling across steel-gray waters, waves like jagged glass crashing against warship hulls. Somewhere out there, the German battleship Bismarck was on the move, the most feared war machine afloat. When word reached the Admiralty in London that Bismarck had slipped from her Norwegian fjord, a chill ran through the corridors of power. Churchill himself reportedly slammed his fist on the table and growled, "Sink the Bismarck, whatever it takes." The Bismarck wasn't just another battleship. She was a symbol of Nazi pride, a floating fortress capable of changing the balance of power at sea. With her were the Prinz Eugen, a sleek, modern heavy cruiser, both heading toward the open Atlantic, the lifeline of Britain's survival. If they reached the convoy routes, they could devastate British shipping and bring the island nation to its knees. So the order was clear: find her, stop her, destroy her. At Scapa Flow, the great anchorage of the Royal Navy, the message flashed through the decks of HMS Hood and her companion, HMS Prince of Wales, a brand new battleship still not fully combat ready. Her gun turrets jammed occasionally. Her crew was green, but time was short. As dawn broke, the Hood's engines roared to life, churning the sea into froth. Her black hull cut through the northern waters, flanked by the smaller, younger Prince of Wales. Together, they set out into the Denmark Strait, the icy gateway between Greenland and Iceland, a stretch of sea notorious for its fog, its storms, and its silence. Inside the Hood, the mood was tense but proud. The crew had heard the whispers that the Bismarck was bigger, newer, deadlier. But the Hood had reputation, experience, and honor. In the mess deck, men spoke quietly over mugs of steaming tea. "We've got the old girl with us," one sailor said. "No German ship can match that." "Aye," another replied, trying to sound brave. "But the Bismarck's no ordinary ship, mate." On the bridge, Admiral Lancelot Holland, a calm, calculating man, studied weather reports and radar plots. He knew the odds. The Hood was fast and powerful, but she had one fatal flaw: her thin deck armor. If the Bismarck could hit her from above, one lucky shell could pierce her like paper. Holland's plan was simple, but risky. He would close the distance as quickly as possible, forcing a side-on duel, ship against ship, gun against gun, where Hood AS speed and training might overcome the German S superior firepower. It was a gamble, but war often was. For nearly 2 days, the British fleet scoured the freezing waters of the Denmark Strait. Fog rolled in thick as smoke, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Somewhere out there, the Bismarck was moving, silent, unseen. Every few hours, new signals crackled over the wireless. Reports of a shadow spotted by patrol aircraft, a flicker on radar. Nothing concrete. The tension was unbearable. Midshipman Ted Briggs, who served on the Hood's bridge, would later recall, "You could feel it in your bones. Something was coming." Every man knew this wasn't just another patrol. This was destiny. By the evening of May 23rd, the first contact came. The cruiser HMS Suffolk, shadowing through fog, sent a signal. Enemy in sight, one battleship, one heavy cruiser. The room fell silent. Officers leaned over maps. Holland stood tall and ordered, "Maintain radio silence. We'll approach from the southwest. We'll cut them off." The chase was on. Through the night, Hood and Prince of Wales steamed at full speed, their massive turbines roaring. The sea slammed against their bows, but they didn't slow. The cold wind whipped across the decks, stinging faces, numbing fingers. Below, the gunners checked ammunition and loaded shells the size of motorcycles into the hoists. One officer noted in his journal, "The men are ready. There's fear, yes, but also pride. We're hunting the most powerful ship in the world, and we're doing it with the mightiest ship Britain ever built." Just before dawn on May 24th, as the sky turned from black to silver, the mist began to lift. In that pale northern light, lookouts shouted, faint shapes on the horizon, 2 ships, distant but unmistakable, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen. Admiral Holland's order came sharp and clear. Action stations. Alarms blared through the Hood's corridors. Men ran to positions. Guns rotated toward the target. The calm before the storm shattered into a symphony of steel and adrenaline. Sailors buckled life jackets, though most knew they'd be useless if a shell found them. The sound of heavy boots echoed on steel decks. The mighty 15-inch guns began to rise, black barrels glinting in the dawnlight. From the Hood's bridge, the German ships were tiny specks, yet every officer aboard knew those specks could decide the fate of nations. Captain Kerr turned to Holland. "Shall we open fire, sir?" Holland stared through his binoculars, the wind tearing at his coat. He nodded once. "Yes, let's see what the old girl's made of." At 05:52 a.m., Hood fired the first salvo. The thunder was deafening. The deck trembled. A shockwave rippled through the ship as her guns roared, spitting flame and smoke across the sea. The shells screamed through the air, arcing toward the distant enemy. Seconds later, the Bismarck replied. The world seemed to explode. Water erupted around the Hood as massive shells slammed into the sea, towering columns of spray rising higher than her masts. The calm gray ocean became a battlefield of chaos and fire. In those opening minutes, the British gunners worked with deadly precision. Their first salvos straddled the German ships. Cheers echoed through the lower decks. Maybe, just maybe, they had the upper hand. But the Bismarck's gunners were equally skilled. Her fire control systems were advanced, her rangefinders near perfect. Slowly, methodically, they adjusted their aim. Then came the hit that changed history. At 05:58, one of Bismarck's 15-inch shells found its mark. It struck the Hood just aft of her mainmast, near her ammunition magazines. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a flash. A blinding, white-hot flash that ripped through the ship like a miniature sun. The explosion was so violent it split the Hood in two. In mere seconds, Britain's proudest ship was gone, swallowed by the sea. Out of a crew of 1,418, only 3 men survived. But that horror, that moment, we'll explore in the next section. Because the sinking of the Hood didn't just end a battle, it shattered Britain's heart. The moment was so sudden, so violent, that even the men aboard the Prince of Wales, just a few miles away, couldn't believe what they were seeing. 1 second, HMS Hood, proud, invincible, charging through the gray Atlantic, was there. The next, she was gone. A column of flame erupted from her midsection, shooting hundreds of feet into the sky. A roar followed, deep, guttural, like the earth itself had cracked open. For a few seconds, the entire horizon glowed orange. Then came the thunderous concussion, shaking the sea and rattling the Prince of Wales to her core. "My God," one officer whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. "The Hood's blown up." At 05:58 a.m., just 6 minutes after the battle began, Britain's greatest warship, the pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of empire and might, was obliterated. From the bridge of the Prince of Wales, men stood frozen. Where moments earlier had been a ship longer than 2 football fields, now there was only wreckage, burning oil, debris, and the cold, merciless sea. The Hood had been struck near her aft magazines, where tons of ammunition were stored. The Bismarck's shell pierced her deck armor, ignited the magazines, and in an instant, the ship's heart exploded. Eyewitnesses said it looked as though she had folded in half before disappearing beneath the waves. No distress signal. No time to fight the fire. Only chaos. Within moments, the Prince of Wales's lookouts spotted figures in the water, tiny specks against the raging sea. The order came. Stop engines. Launch rescue boats. But they couldn't. The Bismarck was still firing, her guns trained on the Prince of Wales. Any attempt to stop meant suicide. So, the British destroyers were ordered to stay behind and search for survivors, once the Germans were gone. Hours later, when the destroyer HMS Electra arrived, the sea was littered with debris, shattered wood, twisted steel, and oil slicks stretching miles. Only 3 men were pulled from the freezing water: Midshipman Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and ordinary signalman Colin Briggs. 3 souls for more than 1,400. Ted Briggs would later recall the moment of the explosion with haunting clarity. "There was a bright flash," he said, "and the ship lifted. I remember being thrown into the air, then into the sea. I came up choking, covered in oil. I turned, and she was gone. Nothing left but black water." He would never forget the silence that followed. No screams, no shouts, just the hiss of burning oil and the whisper of waves, carrying away Britain's greatest warship into eternity. News of the disaster reached London within hours. In the war rooms beneath Westminster, Winston Churchill was informed that HMS Hood had been destroyed. For a moment, even he was silent. Then slowly, he said, "The loss of the Hood is a heavy blow." She was more than a ship. She was the Royal Navy. The British public was devastated. Newspapers carried the grim headline the next morning: HMS Hood sunk, only 3 survivors. Across the nation, families wept. For decades, the Hood had been Britain's pride, a floating fortress that represented safety, power, and national honor. Children had grown up hearing her name. Sailors dreamed of serving aboard her. Now she was gone, lost in less than 10 minutes. For the Royal Navy, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a wound to the soul. In ports across Britain, flags flew at half-mast. Radio broadcasts fell silent for a minute of mourning. Even seasoned admirals couldn't hide their grief. Vice Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, sent a single message to all ships: "The Hood has gone down. The Bismarck must be destroyed." It wasn't an order anymore. It was vengeance. The death of HMS Hood became a rallying cry. Across the Royal Navy, men swore an oath. They would not rest until the Bismarck, the ship that had dared to destroy Britain's pride, was sent to the bottom of the sea. Meanwhile, far away in the cold corridors of the German battleship Bismarck, there was no celebration. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commander of the German task force, was grim-faced. He had seen the explosion through his binoculars. He turned to his officers and said quietly, "A magnificent ship has gone down." Even Captain Ernst Lindemann, Bismarck's commander, refused to cheer. He ordered a moment of silence for the fallen British sailors. They knew what it meant. The British would never forgive them. Lütjens' radio officer sent a single message back to Berlin: "Battleship Hood sunk. Bismarck damaged." Yes, damaged. Because amid her victory, the Bismarck herself was wounded. A shell from the Prince of Wales had torn into her fuel tanks, leaving a slick of oil trailing behind her. It was a small hit, but it would seal her fate. As Bismarck turned south toward the French coast to make repairs, she left behind a trail that the Royal Navy could follow, a trail of oil and vengeance. And now, the hunt was on. Across the Atlantic, Britain's entire home fleet mobilized. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, all converging on a single point in the ocean. Churchill himself gave the order that echoed through every ship's loudspeaker: "Sink the Bismarck." In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the survivors of the Hood drifted silently, watching the sun set over the endless sea. Ted Briggs clung to a piece of wreckage, shivering, his body covered in oil and salt. He whispered a prayer for the men who had gone down, for his friends, his shipmates, his ship. He would later say, "She wasn't just steel and guns. She was home, she was family, and she went down fighting." That night, as the searchlights faded and the ocean swallowed the last traces of the Hood, Britain's grief hardened into resolve. The pride of the Royal Navy had fallen, but her spirit would live on in the steel hearts of every man hunting the Bismarck. The sinking of HMS Hood wasn't just a defeat. It was a declaration of war upon the very pride of Britain. In a single fiery moment, the Royal Navy's most famous warship had been erased from existence. The British public was shocked, grieving, and furious. In London, Churchill's command echoed through every naval signal station, every warship, every captain's cabin across the fleet. Sink the Bismarck. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an oath. The Admiralty scrambled every available ship in the North Atlantic. HMS King George V, HMS Rodney, HMS Ark Royal, and dozens of destroyers surged out of their harbors. The Royal Navy, battered by years of war, was suddenly united by one purpose: vengeance for the Hood. As the news reached the fleet, silence fell among crews. Then came a quiet, collective resolve, the kind that comes from anger too deep for words. On the battleship King George V, sailors gathered in the mess deck, whispering about the Hood's end. "She went down in minutes," one said, eyes dark. "They say only 3 made it out." "Then God help the Germans," another muttered. "We'll send their devil ship to the bottom." Even in the cold corridors of Scapa Flow, where veterans had seen every kind of loss, there was disbelief. The Hood was supposed to be untouchable, a legend forged in steel. And now she was gone. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, stood over the operations map in the Admiralty War Room. His voice was low, deliberate. "We'll find her," he said, "and we'll finish this." Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, the Bismarck was running. Her decks still bore scorch marks from the battle. Her crew worked frantically to patch fuel lines, plug leaks, and tend to the wounded. Inside the radio room, Captain Ernst Lindemann demanded reports. His ship was still seaworthy, but one hit from the Prince of Wales had ruptured her oil tanks. The leak left a long, dark trail on the water, a visible scar across the sea. That oil slick would become her undoing. For now, the Bismarck's plan was simple: reach the safety of the French coast, where Luftwaffe planes could protect her. But every hour brought new danger. The Royal Navy was coming, and fast. The chase began like a storm building across the ocean. In the skies above, British reconnaissance planes from Coastal Command swept the North Atlantic, scanning mile after mile of empty gray water. They spotted nothing, until one pilot saw it, a long black streak cutting through the waves, an oil slick. He followed it low and fast. At the end of that trail was a dark shadow, massive, moving, unmistakable. "Contact! Contact! Enemy battleship sighted!" The message raced through Allied radios like lightning. The Royal Navy now had its target. By May 26th, after 2 days of pursuit, the fleet closed in. The aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal launched her Swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, canvas-winged biplanes that looked almost ridiculous against the might of the German super battleship. The pilots knew their odds were slim. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns were devastatingly accurate, and the weather was brutal, wind and sleet slashing across the decks. Yet they flew anyway. Through hail and tracer fire, they dived toward the monster of steel below. Bombs missed. Torpedoes splashed into the sea. Then, in one last desperate run, a Swordfish from Squadron 818 released its torpedo from barely 100 meters. It struck the Bismarck's stern, exactly where it hurt most. There was a deafening boom. The blast jammed the Bismarck's rudder, locking it in place. Now she could only turn in wide, helpless circles. Aboard the Bismarck, chaos erupted. Sailors screamed orders. Damaged crews fought to regain control. But the ship, the most powerful in the world, was crippled, unable to steer. Admiral Lutyens remained calm, his voice steady as he gave orders. "We will fight to the last shell." He knew there was no escape. The following morning, British ships surrounded her like wolves around a wounded bear. The King George V and Rodney opened fire, unleashing a storm of steel and thunder. The sea lit up with fire. For nearly 2 hours, they pounded the Bismarck without mercy. Her superstructure was obliterated, her guns silenced one by one. Inside the Bismarck, men fought fires, carried wounded comrades, and prayed. Many sang the German naval anthem, their voices faint under the roar of explosions. Finally, at 10:39 a.m., the order was given to scuttle the ship. The crew opened valves, detonated charges, and the Great Bismarck began to sink. From above, British sailors watched in silence as the massive hull rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. One officer whispered, "That's for the Hood." The hunt was over. When the guns fell silent, the sea was calm again. But in that calm lay the wreckage of two legends, the Hood and the Bismarck, bound together forever in history. The British sailors aboard the destroyers who picked up German survivors looked at the men they'd just defeated. Many were young, terrified, clinging to debris. One British seaman said later, "We hated what they'd done, but seeing them there, just boys, half dead in the water, it didn't feel like victory." Of the Bismarck's 2,200 men, only 114 survived. The rest went down with their ship. In London, the news reached Churchill. He paused, then said the words that would be remembered for generations. "The Bismarck is sunk." For Britain, it was closure, but not triumph. The loss of HMS Hood still haunted the nation. The Prime Minister later wrote, "We may have avenged the Hood, but we shall never forget her." In the months that followed, memorials were held in ports and cities across the United Kingdom. Photographs of the Hood's crew were placed in shop windows, churches, and newspapers. Mothers received telegrams confirming what they already feared, that their sons would never return. And deep below the Denmark Strait, where the icy water never rests, the Hood lay silent, her hull split in two, her flag buried beneath miles of ocean. Yet for the men who survived, for Ted Briggs, the youngest officer aboard the Hood, her memory would never fade. He would spend his life telling her story, ensuring the world remembered not just the ship, but the 1,415 souls who went down with her. "She was more than a ship," Briggs once said softly. "She was the heart of the Navy. And that heart still beats, in every sailor who remembers." The morning after HMS Hood vanished beneath the North Atlantic, the sea was eerily calm, too calm for what had just transpired. The wreckage of Britain's greatest warship drifted silently across the gray waves. Oil slicks stretched like scars across the surface, mingling with shattered wood and the few remains of what was once the mighty Hood. Only 3 men, 3 out of 1,418, clung to life in the freezing water. The rest were gone, swallowed by the sea in less than 3 minutes. News of Hood's destruction struck Britain like a thunderclap. Within hours, telegrams buzzed through the Admiralty in London. Senior officers, their faces pale and grim, gathered around a large plotting table marked with pins and strings, showing the last known positions of the Bismarck. Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself was informed of the disaster. He paused for only a moment before giving one of the most chilling and resolute orders in naval history: "Sink the Bismarck." Those 3 words became a national obsession, a vow carved into the heart of Britain's Royal Navy. The Hood had been more than just a ship. It was a symbol of British pride, a floating embodiment of empire and endurance. Now that pride lay shattered at the bottom of the Denmark Strait. There would be no rest until vengeance was achieved. The shockwave across the empire. Across the British Isles, radios crackled with grim reports. Newspapers printed extra editions with bold black headlines. HMS Hood sunk, nearly all hands lost. Families of sailors wept in towns and harbors across England, Scotland, and Wales. The Hood had been the people's ship. For 2 decades, she had visited ports around the world, representing Britain's might. Children had sent letters to her crew. Cities had proudly adopted her as their own. Now, she was gone. In pubs, people spoke in hushed tones. In churches, prayers were whispered not only for the dead, but for the men who would soon be sent to find their killer. The sense of collective grief transformed into a burning determination. Britain, already battered by the Blitz and fighting for survival, found new purpose: to avenge Hood. Bismarck on the run. Meanwhile, far out in the cold expanse of the Atlantic, the German battleship Bismarck sailed on, wounded but defiant. During the engagement with Hood and Prince of Wales, one of her fuel tanks had been ruptured by a British shell. Oil leaked behind her like a black trail, marking her path through the ocean, a deadly clue that the Royal Navy would soon exploit. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding the Bismarck, knew his situation was perilous. His original mission was to break into the North Atlantic and raid Allied shipping lanes, but now the element of surprise was lost. Every British warship in the Atlantic was being diverted to hunt him down. The hunter had become the hunted. Aboard Bismarck, the mood was tense but proud. The sailors knew they had struck a devastating blow. They had destroyed Hood, the pride of Britain, in a battle that lasted barely 10 minutes. But victory brought no comfort. Every man aboard understood that retribution was coming. The Royal Navy mobilizes. In Scapa Flow, Iceland, and along the coast of Britain, ships began to move. It was one of the largest naval pursuits in history. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were ordered to converge from all directions. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal scrambled her Swordfish torpedo bombers, while the battleships King George V, Rodney, and Prince of Wales gave chase. The coordination effort was staggering, a massive fleet fanning out over thousands of miles of ocean. Radio messages were encrypted and transmitted around the clock. Every radar blip, every intercepted signal, every oil slick in the water was analyzed for clues. Churchill's words echoed through the fleet. The Bismarck must be destroyed at all costs. The Royal Navy was willing to burn every drop of fuel, risk every ship, and cross every storm-tossed sea to bring her down. A game of shadows. For days, the North Atlantic became a chessboard of death. The Bismarck disappeared into the fog, using bad weather and her speed to evade her pursuers. British ships spread out in a desperate attempt to predict her course. Some headed west, believing she would escape into the Atlantic. Others guarded the route toward France, where German aircraft and submarines could protect her. Every hour mattered. The Bismarck was moving fast and her fuel was running low. If she reached the safety of occupied France, the British knew they might never have another chance to stop her. In London, Admiralty analysts worked feverishly, drawing potential routes on massive ocean charts. Then came a vital clue. A Catalina flying boat from the US Navy, operating alongside the British, sighted Bismarck through the clouds. The message was brief but electrifying. Bismarck sighted, bearing 240 degrees. Position confirmed. The chase was back on. Storms and sacrifice. In gale force winds and heavy rain, British ships pushed their engines to the limit. The sea heaved and roared, tossing the destroyers like toys. Men went without sleep, without food, their faces pale from exhaustion and salt spray. But no one complained. Every sailor knew why they were there, for Hood. On the carrier Ark Royal, the Swordfish crews prepared for one of the most dangerous missions in naval aviation history. Their biplanes were slow, outdated relics from another era, fabric-covered wings and open cockpits, yet they were the only ones available. As one pilot joked grimly before takeoff, "We're going up in museum pieces to fight the pride of the German fleet." As they roared into the storm, buffeted by wind and rain, the Swordfish pilots descended upon Bismarck. The sea below churned like molten steel. The sky lit with tracer fire. The Germans fired furiously, the air filled with explosions and flak bursts. Then, by sheer luck, or fate, one torpedo struck Bismarck's rudder. It jammed her steering gear, leaving her unable to turn. Bismarck, once the hunter, was now a wounded beast circling helplessly in the Atlantic. As the news reached the Admiralty, a grim satisfaction spread across the command center. The Hood had been avenged in spirit, but the hunt wasn't over yet. The next day would bring the final confrontation. The British fleet was closing in. The Bismarck was crippled, and the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and emotional naval battles in history. The moment when Britain's loss would finally be answered with fire and steel. Dawn broke cold and gray over the North Atlantic. The wind carried the scent of oil and iron across the waves. Somewhere beyond the mist, the Bismarck waited, crippled, cornered, and defiant. The pride of Hitler's navy was no longer the hunter. She was a wounded predator surrounded by the wolves of the Royal Navy. For the men aboard Britain's warships, the day began not with breakfast, but with vengeance. After 5 relentless days of pursuit across thousands of miles of treacherous sea, the moment had finally arrived. The echoes of HMS Hood's destruction still haunted every sailor's mind. Her ghost seemed to whisper through the steel corridors, "Do not fail us." The trap tightens. By sunrise on May 27, 1941, Bismarck was trapped. The torpedo from the Swordfish biplane the night before had jammed her rudders, locking her into a slow, helpless circle. She could still fire her guns, but she could no longer steer. Her captain, Ernst Lindemann, and Admiral Günther Lütjens stood on the bridge, aware that their fate was sealed. Around them, the sea stretched in every direction, cold, gray, endless. And in that emptiness, the faint outlines of approaching ships began to appear through the fog. The British were coming. The battleships King George V and Rodney led the charge. Behind them, cruisers and destroyers tightened the noose. The order was simple: Sink the Bismarck. No capture, no mercy. Aboard Rodney, sailors manned their massive 16-inch guns. The steel monsters groaned as they turned toward their target. In the command room, Admiral Sir John Tovey gave the final command in a steady voice. Open fire. Hell unleashed. At 08:47 a.m., the sea exploded with thunder. Rodney's first salvo roared into the air, shaking the very ocean. Moments later, King George V joined in. The sky filled with smoke and flame as massive shells screamed across the water. Each shell weighed nearly a ton, a flying fortress of destruction. Bismarck returned fire with astonishing precision. Her forward guns boomed, sending shock waves through the storm. Shells whistled past Rodney's bridge, some so close that they sent up columns of water higher than the masts. For half an hour, both sides exchanged fury. The sea boiled with explosions. The British ships advanced slowly, their guns lighting up the fog like flashes of lightning. Then, at 09:02 a.m., a British shell found its mark. A direct hit smashed into Bismarck's forward guns, silencing her main battery. Flames erupted across her deck. Men screamed as fire raced through the corridors. The mighty ship began to burn. But Bismarck didn't surrender. Her remaining guns kept firing, defiant, desperate, as if refusing to die. Tala Fajant, at 09:30 a.m., Bismarck was crippled beyond recovery. Her masts were shattered, her guns destroyed, and her engines failing. Shells continued to rain down mercilessly, over 2,800 rounds in total. British gunners aimed with precision, targeting her superstructure, tearing apart her bridge, and reducing her to twisted steel. Inside the ship, chaos reigned. Fires raged unchecked. The corridors filled with smoke and screams. Lifeboats had been blown to splinters. Still, many sailors refused to abandon their posts. They fought to keep pumps running, to man anti-aircraft guns, to save what little honor remained. Admiral Lutyens was last seen standing calmly near the bridge, his uniform immaculate despite the flames. When a shell struck the bridge directly, killing everyone inside, no one knew his final words, only that he died facing his enemy. By 10 a.m., Bismarck was a floating ruin. She drifted aimlessly, listing heavily to port. British destroyers moved closer, launching torpedoes to finish the job. Each explosion sent towering plumes of water and fire skyward. Then, suddenly, the firing stopped. The Royal Navy's guns fell silent. A stillness settled over the battlefield, a silence filled with both triumph and sorrow. The Bismarck, once the pride of the German fleet, was sinking. Slowly, majestically, she began to roll onto her side. Men could be seen jumping into the icy water, clinging to debris, shouting for help that would never come. The sea, as always, showed no mercy. Witnesses to the end. From the decks of King George V, British sailors watched as the giant ship disappeared beneath the waves. Many cheered. The avenging of Hood was complete. But as they watched men struggle and vanish into the cold water, the cheers faded. One sailor later wrote in his diary, "We watched her die, and though she was our enemy, I felt no joy. She was magnificent and terrible." The Bismarck slipped beneath the surface at 10:40 a.m. The Atlantic swallowed her whole. In less than 10 minutes, the most feared warship of the modern age was gone. Over 2,000 German sailors perished. Only 114 survived, rescued by British and German vessels before a U-boat threat forced the search to end. Aftermath of vengeance. When news reached London that Bismarck had been destroyed, there was a strange quiet in the Admiralty. The mission had been a success. Hood was avenged, but the cost had been enormous. Thousands of lives lost, days of brutal combat, and the destruction of two symbols of naval power. Churchill, upon hearing the news, simply nodded and said, "The Bismarck is sunk." It wasn't celebration. It was closure, grim and heavy. The Royal Navy had restored its honor, but every sailor knew what it had cost. In ports across Britain, bells rang to mark the victory. But among the families of the Hood's crew, the sound was bittersweet. Their loved ones would never return, but justice had been done. Legacy of fire and steel. The wreck of the Bismarck lay undiscovered for nearly 5 decades until 1989, when oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic, located her resting place nearly 16,000 feet below the surface. She sat upright, eerily intact, a ghostly monument to the brutality of war. Close by, pieces of Hood-S wreckage also rest at the bottom of the Denmark Strait, two steel giants eternally connected by fate. The battle between Hood and Bismarck was more than a clash of ships. It was a duel of nations, pride, and human endurance. It was a story of vengeance, courage, and the haunting cost of war. And though both ships are gone, their stories remain, carried by the waves, whispered through the cold Atlantic winds, and remembered by those who still hear the echo of guns across the sea. The sea was calm again. The roar of cannons had faded, replaced by the sound of waves lapping against steel hulls and the occasional cry of a distant gull. But beneath that calm, the Atlantic held its secrets, thousands of them, entombed in the dark depths where the Bismarck and Hood now rested. For the men who had survived the battle, the silence after victory felt almost unbearable. There was no cheering, no music, no sense of triumph. Only exhaustion and the haunting realization that the ocean had claimed yet another generation of sailors. On the decks of the British warships, men moved slowly, their faces smeared with soot and salt. They had avenged their comrades, but the sight of hundreds of men thrashing in the freezing water below turned celebration into quiet reflection. Some whispered prayers, others simply turned away. The ocean's graveyard. The North Atlantic had always been a merciless arena, a place where even the strongest ships could vanish in minutes. Sailors knew it as both protector and predator. It hid them from the enemy but swallowed them just as easily. That morning, as the last of the survivors were pulled from the icy waves, the British sailors stared into the endless gray expanse and realized that this sea, cold and beautiful, was now the grave of Hood and Bismarck. Both ships, symbols of national pride, had been reduced to wreckage within a single week. Together, they had cost over 3,500 lives, young men from both nations who would never see land again. Even amid war, there was respect. British sailors spoke quietly of the German sailors' bravery. They had fought to the last shell, refusing to surrender. One officer aboard King George V later said, "We sank her, yes, but I could not bring myself to hate them. They fought like lions." Britain's mourning back in Britain, the news of the Bismarck's destruction spread quickly. Newspapers shouted "Hood avenged" in bold letters, but the people's joy was mixed with sorrow. The memory of the Hood's loss still cut deep. In small towns and quiet villages across the country, black flags fluttered on church spires. The Royal Navy's finest, the men who had manned Hood with pride and courage, were gone. At the Portsmouth Naval Memorial, families gathered to hear the names read aloud. Hundreds upon hundreds of names carved into stone. Mothers clutched photographs of sons who would never come home. Wives stood silently with children who would grow up without fathers. Churchill called Hood the pride of the Royal Navy, and her loss was felt like a personal wound to Britain itself. She had symbolized power, confidence, and the indomitable spirit of the Empire. Her destruction reminded everyone that even the mightiest could fall. Germany's silence. In Germany, news of the Bismarck's sinking was met with disbelief, and then silence. Nazi propaganda had declared her invincible, the embodiment of German naval superiority. Now she lay shattered beneath the sea. Families of the sailors received telegrams marked "missing in action." Entire communities were devastated. For many, their sons had sailed away in glory and vanished without a trace. Admiral Karl Donitz, upon hearing the report, stood in grim silence. He ordered no public mourning, only quiet respect. Privately, he wrote in his log, "The Bismarck has fallen. With her, the heart of the fleet sinks into the Atlantic." To the German Navy, it was more than a defeat. It was a humiliation, a reminder that even the strongest ship could not defy fate forever. The psychological war. The battle between Hood and Bismarck had done more than sink ships. It had changed minds. The Royal Navy had been reminded that pride alone was not enough. Innovation and intelligence were the new weapons of survival. After Hood's loss, naval engineers began re-evaluating ship design. They studied every detail, armor thickness, deck angles, shell trajectories, determined never to repeat the same mistakes. The unsinkable myth had died with Hood. For the German Navy, the lesson was equally painful. Bismarck's mission had been a gamble, a bold strike to cripple Britain's lifeline of supply convoys. Instead, it became a disaster that warned of the dangers of overconfidence. The North Atlantic had proved that technology and firepower meant nothing without coordination, intelligence, and luck. The ocean didn't care about national pride. It cared only about balance. The emotional toll. Years later, survivors would still dream of that day. The thunder of guns, the scream of shells, the sudden silence when the sea swallowed their friends. One British gunner, interviewed decades later, said, "When Bismarck went down, I thought I'd feel relief. But all I saw were men like us, drowning. We weren't fighting monsters. We were fighting other sailors trapped in the same hell." For many veterans, the battle left scars that never healed. Some returned to sea, others couldn't bear to. The Royal Navy honored the fallen every May, holding moments of silence as ships passed near the site of Hood's demise. The ocean itself seemed to remember. Fishermen spoke of strange echoes on sonar near the Denmark Strait, metallic moans like the groaning of a wounded giant beneath the waves. History's judgment. In the decades that followed, historians debated the legacy of the Hood and Bismarck. Some called their duel the last great gentleman's battle, fought ship to ship, man to man, before submarines and missiles changed warfare forever. Others saw it as a tragic symbol of arrogance. Two nations obsessed with proving superiority, only to be humbled by the sea. Yet even critics could not deny the heroism of the men who fought. They faced death not with fear, but with discipline and duty. When Hood exploded, her gunners still fired until the last moment. When Bismarck sank, her crew refused to abandon ship until ordered. Their courage transcended politics. It became part of naval legend, a reminder that even in war, humanity endures. The echoes continue. Every year, wreaths are cast into the sea where Hood and Bismarck rest. Naval officers stand in silence, their uniforms gleaming in the morning light as the waves close over the flowers. The Atlantic remains quiet, a watery cathedral of remembrance. Down below, two great ships sleep side by side, bound forever by the fire and fury of that fateful week in May 1941. As the narrator's voice fades, one image remains: the Union Jack fluttering over the cold gray waves, sunlight breaking through the clouds, and the distant haunting echo of a ship's bell ringing beneath the sea. The ocean keeps its secrets, but the story of HMS Hood, her pride, her fall, and the vengeance that followed, will never be forgotten. For half a century, HMS Hood lay undisturbed beneath the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, a steel tomb in eternal darkness. The world above moved on. Wars ended, empires fell, and generations came and went. But deep below, where light could not reach, the pride of the Royal Navy still slept. To many Britons, Hood was more than just a lost warship. She was a symbol frozen in time, a reminder of youth, courage, and sacrifice. For decades, families of her crew had only one question: where exactly did she rest? The sea, however, guards its secrets jealously. The Denmark Strait, vast, remote, and nearly 3 kilometers deep, was not a friendly place for explorers. Yet the mystery of Hood's resting place continued to haunt naval historians and veterans alike. And then, in the late 20th century, technology finally caught up with history's silence. The search begins. In 2001, the Royal Navy announced an expedition unlike any before, a joint mission led by marine archaeologist David Mearns to locate and document the wreck of HMS Hood. For many, it was not just a scientific mission, it was a pilgrimage. The research vessel Sea Explorer sailed into the frigid North Atlantic, its crew equipped with the latest sonar, remote-operated vehicles, and submersible cameras. The goal: to find the remains of Hood, pay tribute to her crew, and finally close a chapter left open since 1941. Every wave that struck the ship's hull felt like a heartbeat echoing through time. On board, descendants of Hood's crew waited in silence, their faces marked by hope and dread. Would they find her? Or would the sea keep her hidden forever? Echoes in the deep. After days of scanning, the sonar screens began to whisper. Faint shapes appeared, jagged outlines against the seafloor. Slowly, technology began to peel away the darkness. And then, the unmistakable image emerged: the shattered hull of HMS Hood, lying 9,334 feet below the surface. She was broken in two, her stern and bow separated by nearly half a mile of seabed. When the cameras descended, the world above watched in awe. The once proud battlecruiser was now a silent ruin, her turrets twisted, her decks torn open by the explosion that had sealed her fate. Yet even in death, Hood retained her majesty. Her 15-inch guns still pointed toward the horizon, as if standing guard over the sailors who had gone down with her. A somber discovery. As the remotely operated vehicle drifted across the wreck, a hush fell over the control room. Then, amid the wreckage, a human touch appeared. A sailor's boot, still resting near the torn hull. The room went silent. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. It was not just metal they had found. It was memory. It was sacrifice. One officer whispered, "She's home now." The team placed a brass plaque on the seabed, engraved with the names of all 1,415 men who perished that day. It read simply, "In memory of the ship's company of HMS Hood, may they rest in peace." The moment was broadcast across Britain. Elderly veterans, some of whom had served alongside Hood in their youth, watched through tears. For them, the discovery was both a wound reopened and finally healed. Messages from the past among the families watching was a woman named Jean Hood, the niece of one of the sailors lost in 1941. She clutched a faded photograph of her uncle, taken on the deck of Hood shortly before her final voyage. When the image of the wreck appeared on television, she whispered softly, "We found you, Uncle. After all these years, we found you." Letters poured into the Royal Navy from families who had waited a lifetime for closure. Children who had never met their fathers now had a place to mourn. For them, the depths of the Atlantic were no longer an empty void. They were sacred ground. The wreck as a war grave. Following the discovery, the British government declared HMS Hood an official war grave. No artifact would be removed, no souvenir taken. The site would remain untouched, a resting place for heroes. Naval chaplains held a service aboard the Sea Explorer. As the ship drifted above the wreck, they recited the Navy's traditional prayer for the fallen. "They that go down to the sea in ships, and occupy their business in great waters. These men see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep." Then a wreath was cast into the sea. Its crimson roses floated briefly before sinking, one petal at a time toward the depths where Hood lay. The ceremony was not of victory but of remembrance. The Atlantic had claimed her, but history had not forgotten her. A nation remembers. The rediscovery of HMS Hood rekindled interest in her story across Britain. Documentaries aired, museums filled with visitors, and once again her name was spoken with reverence. At the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth, a special exhibit was created, The Mighty Hood. Inside, visitors could see models, photographs, and video footage of the wreck. At the center stood a simple brass bell, the original ship's bell, recovered respectfully from the site and restored. When the bell was first rung during a remembrance ceremony, the sound was clear and haunting, a voice from beneath the sea, echoing through history. Many in the audience wept. For them, it was as if the ship herself had spoken one last time. The legacy beneath the waves. Today, HMS Hood lies peacefully in the deep, her hull blanketed by silt, her guns silent but steadfast. She remains one of the most hauntingly beautiful wrecks ever discovered, a frozen monument to bravery and loss. Marine life now drifts through her corridors. Fish swim where officers once dined. Coral clings to her armor, turning tragedy into life. Nature, in its quiet mercy, has begun to heal her wounds. Each year, the Royal Navy conducts a memorial service over her resting place. Modern destroyers and submarines pass silently above, saluting their fallen predecessor. Her story, from her glorious launch to her fiery end and eventual rediscovery, stands as one of the most powerful testaments to the courage of those who sail the seas. Eternal vigil. In the stillness of the Atlantic depths, HMS Hood keeps watch. The current hums softly against her hull, like the faint whisper of an old song. Far above, sunlight flickers on the surface, brief, fleeting, unable to pierce the dark. Yet somehow it feels as if the light still reaches her. For Britain, Hood is not just a ship. She is memory itself, a symbol of pride, tragedy, and endurance. And as long as ships sail under the Union Jack, her name will be remembered. Not for how she died, but for how bravely she lived. In the vast, cold expanse of the North Atlantic, two steel giants once faced each other, HMS Hood and the Bismarck. Their meeting lasted only minutes, yet it would echo across generations. It was a duel not just between ships, but between nations, pride, and destiny itself. A new power rises. It began in the mid-1930s, when a newly rearmed Germany sought to reclaim its place on the world stage. The Bismarck, named after the Iron Chancellor who unified the German Empire, was more than a ship. She was a statement. At over 820 feet long and displacing 50,000 tons when fully loaded, Bismarck was a floating fortress. Her armor was so thick that no Allied shell had ever penetrated it during trials. Her main guns, 8 15-inch cannons, could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton across 20 miles. To the world, she was a masterpiece of naval engineering, terrifying, flawless, and unstoppable. But across the Channel in Britain, a name still commanded fear and respect: HMS Hood. She had ruled the waves for 2 decades, the mighty Hood, the embodiment of British naval supremacy. Yet by 1941, time had begun to catch up with her. Her armor was outdated, her design from a bygone era. Still, the Royal Navy believed she was invincible. After all, the Hood had never been truly tested. That was about to change. The hunt begins. In May 1941, intelligence reached London that Bismarck had slipped out of her Norwegian fjord base and was heading for the North Atlantic. Her mission, to destroy Allied convoys bringing vital supplies from America to Britain. If she succeeded, she could cripple Britain's lifeline and possibly change the course of the war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued one of his most famous orders: sink the Bismarck at all costs. And so began one of the greatest naval hunts in history. Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding the battlecruiser squadron, led the pursuit aboard HMS Hood. Accompanying her was the newly built battleship Prince of Wales, a symbol of Britain's modern might. Their orders were simple: intercept the Bismarck before she reached open waters. The fateful encounter. The morning of May 24, 1941, dawned gray and bitterly cold in the Denmark Strait. Fog and sleet swept across the waves as the 2 British ships cut through the sea. At 5:35 a.m., a lookout aboard Hood spotted something on the horizon. Moments later, confirmation. The Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, were steaming toward them. The stage was set. At 5:52 a.m., the Hood opened fire. Her massive guns roared, the sound shaking the decks as the shells screamed toward the enemy. The Prince of Wales followed suit. But Bismarck was ready. Her captain, Ernst Lindemann, ordered the return of fire. Within seconds, the German ship unleashed her own thunder. Precise, powerful, deadly. Shells tore through the mist, slamming into the sea around Hood. Each impact sent walls of water skyward, drenching her decks. The crew worked frantically, shouting orders over the thunder of battle. Then, at 5:56 a.m., it happened. The death of a legend. A single shell from Bismarck, fired from over 15 miles away, struck Hood near her aft magazines. There was a heartbeat of silence, then an explosion. The blast ripped through the battlecruiser with unimaginable force. In a split second, her entire rear section disintegrated. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, followed by a deafening roar that could be heard for miles. The pride of the Royal Navy was torn apart. Within 3 minutes, HMS Hood was gone. Of her crew of 1,418, only 3 survived. Those who witnessed the explosion aboard Prince of Wales could hardly believe what they saw. The great ship, Britain's symbol of power, had vanished, leaving only smoke, fire, and oil spreading across the sea. A stunned sailor aboard Prince of Wales whispered, "The Hood's gone. She's gone." Shockwaves across the empire. News of the Hood's destruction spread through Britain like a thunderclap. In London, the Admiralty issued a brief, somber statement. The Admiralty regrets to announce that HMS Hood has been sunk by enemy action. Across the nation, disbelief turned to grief, and then to rage. Churchill's response was swift and grim. "We must destroy the Bismarck." The hunt resumed with renewed fury. British battleships, cruisers, and aircraft scoured the Atlantic. The Ark Royal's swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, fragile biplanes, would eventually cripple the Bismarck's rudder, leaving her unable to maneuver. On May 27th, just 3 days after Hood's loss, the Royal Navy caught up with her. In a relentless barrage, the British fleet avenged the fallen. The Bismarck was pounded into submission and sunk beneath the waves. As she went down, sailors aboard British ships felt both triumph and sorrow. Justice had been done, but at a terrible cost. 2 giants, 1 fate. In many ways, the story of HMS Hood and Bismarck is not one of victory or defeat, but of inevitability. Both ships represented the peak of their nation's naval pride. Both were seen as unsinkable. Both were destroyed within days of meeting each other. They were, as one historian later wrote, 2 warriors born in different lands, destined to destroy one another. Decades later, when the wrecks of both ships were found, their fates seemed intertwined even in death. Hood lay broken, her pride shattered, a symbol of sacrifice. Bismarck rested upright on the seabed, proud yet doomed, a symbol of power undone by its own arrogance. In the silence of the deep, they sleep only a few hundred miles apart. Echoes through time. Today, their stories are told together, in museums, books, and documentaries. Not as tales of enemies, but as reminders of the fragility of human ambition. The sea, impartial and eternal, remembers them both. Divers who have visited Bismarck's wreck speak of awe and melancholy. "It's not a tomb of war," one explorer said. "It's a place where 2 nations' dreams collided." When the Hood spell was recovered and restored in 2015, it was rung once for each of her 1,415 lost crewmen, and once more for the Bismarck S. 2 sounds, 1 for each ship, 2 legacies forever bound. The final reflection. In the end, HMS Hood and Bismarck were not just war machines, they were symbols of courage, tragedy, and the unrelenting march of history. Their duel lasted less than 10 minutes, but its echo has lasted a lifetime. The sea claimed them both, but in doing so, it made them immortal. And perhaps somewhere deep beneath the cold Atlantic waves, their steel ghosts still face each other, locked forever in the moment where pride met fate and silence followed. The waves of the North Atlantic have long since quieted. The wreckage has settled, the oil has vanished, and the guns that once roared have gone silent. But the name HMS Hood still carries an echo, one that reverberates through history, not merely as a ship lost, but as a symbol of pride, sacrifice, and immortality. The day after the storm. When word of the Hood's destruction reached Britain, it was as though the heart of a nation had stopped. The mighty Hood was more than just a warship. She was Britain's confidence afloat. For 20 years, she had represented British power wherever she sailed. Her sleek lines, majestic presence, and unbroken record made her almost mythical. So when the news broke, Hood has been sunk. Disbelief swept across every corner of the empire. Newspapers printed the story in black borders. Mothers wept for sons, wives clutched letters that would never be answered, and even hardened sailors were struck speechless. One survivor, Ted Briggs, and just 18 years old at the time, would later recall, "It wasn't just a ship that sank. It felt like we'd lost something bigger, like Britain itself had taken a wound that would never heal." The search for answers. In the aftermath, questions haunted the Admiralty. How could Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, be destroyed so completely in less than 3 minutes? Investigations began almost immediately. Was it a design flaw? Bad luck? Or had the Bismarck simply outclassed her? Reports concluded that the shell from Bismarck had pierced Hood's weakly armored deck, igniting the magazines, a flaw known to her designers but long ignored. But many in the Navy refused to accept it. To them, the Hood was invincible. And to admit her vulnerability was to admit that Britain's naval supremacy had passed. It wasn't until decades later, when explorers found her wreck resting 9,000 feet below the surface, that the truth was confirmed. Her hull was split in 2, a catastrophic explosion from within. The very heart of the ship had torn itself apart. Finding the Hood. In July 2001, the famed explorer David Mearns led an expedition to locate the Hood's final resting place. After years of searching, they found her, lying silently on the ocean floor, 1,000 miles west of Norway. Cameras revealed the remains of the once mighty ship. Her bow, broken cleanly from the stern, rested upright, a haunting monument in the dark. And there, among the twisted metal and silt, lay a piece of history, the ship's brass bell. When the footage was broadcast, veterans and families of the crew wept. For decades, Hood had existed only as a memory. Now, she was real again. The expedition held a brief ceremony at sea. A Royal Navy officer read, "For those who gave their lives aboard HMS Hood, we remember you. You are not forgotten." As the wreath floated down, the sea seemed to stand still. The sun broke through the clouds, lighting the water in a brilliant golden hue, as though the mighty Hood herself had risen one last time to salute her crew. The survivor's burden. Only 3 men had survived that terrible morning: Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. All were young, all were forever changed. Briggs would become the public voice of the Hood's memory. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of those lost. The friends he'd laughed with, the officers who'd mentored him, the ship that had been his home. In interviews, his voice often trembled. When I closed my eyes at night, I could still see the flames, still hear the ship breaking apart, still feel the pull of the sea trying to drag me down with her. When the Hood's bell was finally recovered in 2015, it was Briggs' wish that guided the ceremony, even though he had passed away years earlier. The bell was rung once for each of the 1,415 men who perished, and once more for the Bismarck's crew. A gesture of respect, a symbol of forgiveness, a moment where the echoes of war became whispers of peace, a legacy beyond steel. The story of the Hood isn't just about naval warfare, it's about humanity. She represented an era, the twilight of empire, the last breath of the great battle cruisers, and the unshakable belief in British mastery of the seas. Her loss signaled something greater than the sinking of a ship. It marked the end of an age, when battles were fought with pride, when ships were more than metal, when nations built legends that sailed across the waves. To this day, her name graces memorials across the world, from Portsmouth to Scotland, from Sydney to Newfoundland. And in those memorials, carved in stone, is not a tale of defeat, but one of endurance. The Hood Association. In 1975, former sailors and families of the Hood's crew founded the HMS Hood Association. Their mission was simple: to keep her memory alive. Every year, they gather by the sea to read the names, share stories, and remember the ship that shaped their lives. On anniversaries, they say the same words. The ship may be gone, but her spirit sails forever. In schools, museums, and documentaries, new generations learn about her, not as a relic, but as a reminder of bravery and sacrifice. The association's motto reflects this eternal bond, still on patrol, because as long as her name is spoken, the Hood never truly sank. The Eternal Sea. The sea, vast and indifferent, has claimed countless ships, yet some, like the Hood, rise above the waves of time. Her story endures not because of how she died, but because of how she lived, as a symbol of beauty, courage, and hope. Standing on the cliffs of Scapa Flow today, you can almost imagine her returning, cutting through the mist, her guns gleaming, her flag snapping in the wind. For a moment, you might even hear her engines hum, the ghost of the mighty Hood, still sailing somewhere beyond the horizon. Final reflection. The sinking of HMS Hood remains one of the most powerful maritime tragedies in history. But out of the loss came legacy. Out of destruction came remembrance. Her death spurred innovation, reshaped naval strategy, and inspired countless stories of heroism and resilience. And so the Hood lives on, not as a wreck beneath the sea, but as an idea. That courage endures, that pride can inspire, and that even in defeat, honor remains. The sea took her body. History took her story. But the world will never forget her name. HMS Hood. Britain's pride, forever on patrol.